democracy from the threats of extremism and authoritarianism. And for that same reason, he wrote his most recently published book, which we will hear more about tonight. It's called Preparing for War: The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. So Brad's educational background includes graduate degrees in religious studies, theology, and philosophy from various institutions, including Azusa Pacific University, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Oxford University. Let's welcome Dr. Brad Onishi.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you to Pastor Chris and James and everyone who's made this possible. I want to talk tonight about Christian nationalism, maybe something you've heard a lot about, maybe something that you're not sure what to think of, and surely you're not sure what to think of me, a guy who just got off the plane from San Francisco to talk about it. So let's see what we find out tonight, shall we? One of the things I hear a lot when I talk about Christian nationalism around the country is folks say, look, I'm a Christian, and I love America. What's wrong with that? Does that make me a Christian nationalist? And my response is, not at all. The problem, though, is that there are influential folks around our country who would have you believe that look, you're a Christian, you love God, you love America, you're a Christian nationalist, and that's why they're mad, right? Here's somebody who says that quite often.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists. And when Republicans learn to represent most of the people that vote for them, then we will be the party that continues to grow without having to chase down certain identities or chase down, certain segments of people. We just need to represent Americans, and most Americans, no matter how they vote, really care about the same things.
So there's a lot there. Right? Are most Americans Christian nationalists? To be a Christian nationalist, does that just mean you're a Christian who's an American, a Christian who loves America and loves Jesus? That's what Marjorie Taylor Greene says. Okay? My guess is in this room is that most of the people would probably say they do both. They do love God. They do love America. For me, a Christian nationalist is not a matter of loving those two things. It's a matter of thinking that because you love God, you're more of an American than other people. That because you love Jesus, you're actually the real citizen of this country and others are not. To me, that's when we get into Christian nationalism. It's the idea that your Christian identity entitles you to more of America than somebody else. That by dint of being Christian, one gets a special place, an elevated place, an authority that others don't get to claim. I'll be honest, I think Christian nationalism is a Christianity that wants power in the name of God. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. So let's talk about Christian nationalism. How do folks actually measure that? Folks who I hang out with, sociologists and social scientists and others. Well, here's some ways that they do that. If we go and look at our slide here, we can see measuring Christian nationalism. This is from PRI and the Brookings Institute. So when they measure Christian nationalism, they ask folks, hey, should the U.S. government declare this a Christian nation? Should the president or someone, Congress or somebody else, come out and say, hey, the United States is a Christian nation. Here's an executive order, here's an official statement, and so on. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian founding, we won't have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So if we look at the answers to these on the next slide, we'll see that about 27% of Americans agree or sympathize with the idea that the U.S. government should just come out and say it. This is a Christian nation. That's what they should do. That's about a quarter of the country. About 38% of Americans think that if we move away from our Christian founding, we won't have a country anymore. The part I want to zoom in on, and if we were in class, I'm a professor, if we were in class, I'd say, circle that in your notes. Our Christian founding. What does that mean? I want to talk about that a little bit more specifically. On the next slide, though, we have a few more data points. This is from Pew Research Center 2022. And 45% said that the country should be a Christian nation, according to Pew. So that's almost half, okay? And that's not is it, that's it should be, right? This is what it should be. It should be a Christian nation. Now, unsurprisingly, Christian folks were a lot more likely to say that, 69% versus 44%. However, Christians are less likely than non-Christians to say the U.S. is currently a Christian nation. So you can kind of see a big group of Christians that say, should be a Christian nation, big group of Christians saying, but it's not anymore, right? Let's dig into what those things might mean. What I want to say is, as we get into some of this data and we talk a little bit more about Christian nationalism, is it might surprise you that my challenge is not, my challenge tonight is to think about a Christian politics that tries to build a Christian public square, to cultivate in some way a Christian country, but without being Christian nationalist. I want to think through how that might be possible. So I want you to imagine all of us at a round table, Americans of every kind, gathered around a table where everyone has a seat, and there's no head of the table, there's no person in charge. It's a round table. We've got folks from Portland, Oregon, and Portland, Maine. We've got folks from Baton Rouge. We've got folks from Omaha, folks from Sioux City, the Twin Cities, wherever you want to be, Tucson, LA, and so on. We've got folks who are white and black, folks who are Asian and Latino. We have folks who are gay and straight, folks who are rich and not rich. We've got the United States represented. And at that point in the round table, someone stands up and says, hey, y'all, it's good to see you. I don't have a problem with most of you, right? Most of you, I'm kind of glad you're here. But I just need you to know from the start, as we get going with our round table today, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, non-religious, whoever you are, I'm a Christian, and so I just get a kind of different place here at the table, just kind of how it works. It's just is how this country is. I'm sorry if you don't like that, or if you just got here, or maybe that's hard to accept, but I'm just not sure that, we can proceed in the right way unless you all get that. And somebody inevitably is going to say, why? I mean, the Jewish person, the Muslim person, the non-religious person, they're going to say, I don't understand. We're at a round table. This is a country based on liberty and equality and freedom. This is a country based on democracy. I don't understand why you get a raised position. Why do you get more authority than everyone else at the table? And here is always the answer that I hear from Christian nationalists, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, whether it's anyone else. It's always, well, this country was founded as a Christian nation. That's just how it is. That's our history. That's our heritage. So it's really hard to not give the Christian the rightful place at this table, because this is the one that we deserve. We founded the country. It was found for us. It was found by us, and therefore we should get to maintain that heritage and inherit that founding by maintaining privileged positions in the economy, in culture, and certainly in politics when it comes to who's mayor or who's president, who's county supervisor, who's head of the PTA. So I'm going to stop right here and say, and this is going to be the first blunt statement of tonight, this is Christian nationalism. It's a call for Christians to get privilege in the country, for the Christian to have a different status because of what they take to be the country's history. It shows us something, and this is something that I feel very strongly about and very clear about. Christian nationalism is by definition anti-democratic. How do we have a democracy if somebody at the round table says, I get an elevated position? It's not possible. And there's just no arguing with that. Democracies don't have kings. They don't have protected classes. They don't have oligarchs or aristocrats. We don't have nobles. We all love watching The Crown and Downton Abbey, but we don't do that here, do we? You cannot have a real democracy if one class of people, in this case Christians, has a different place than everybody else. Now, I know there's some of you out there that are saying, I don't care. I don't care. I'd rather have a Christian nation based on God's laws and plan for creation than a democracy full of corruption and disorder. I'd rather instill Christianity in a way that I feel like this country may or may not used to have, rather than something else. And so that leads me to another big statement for tonight. and it's one I hope you'll hold on to as we continue. That line of thinking is not only harmful to your neighbors, and I do think it's harmful to your neighbors. I think it's harmful to those people at the round table who believe in an America where we're all equal, we all have one voice, where we share power, and for one group of people to stand up and say, I get the power, or I get more power than you. I think that's pretty hurtful. And I think it's probably easy for all of us to think about ways that's happened in our country in different scenarios, where the people standing up are not the Christian people, right? But they're making that power assertion based on another category or set of categories. So it is harmful to your neighbor, but it's also harmful to the church. It's harmful to you as a Christian. The attempt to infuse the government with Christianity, and thus to give Christians an elevated place in society, is damaging to the Christian faith. And let me demonstrate this. I want to demonstrate the idea that this country was founded as a Christian nation by Christians and for Christians, and thus Christians should get an elevated place, is actually really hurtful to everyone. Everyone at that round table and the Christians standing up and saying they get the privileged place. I want to do that by talking about this idea, founded as a Christian nation. This is a Christian country. How can we get away from that? Now, I hear that a lot. You might have read up about me. I get emails. I have students, I have a lot of folks telling me, this is a Christian country. Look at our history. And I know what you're thinking. Mr. Husker fan from San Francisco here thinks that's completely false, right? And my response to that is, you're not wrong. It's not wrong that there were so many Christians involved in the quote-unquote founding of the United States. There were. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, completely false. Case closed. Thanks for coming, everybody. What I want to say is, when we talk about the founding of America, I want to talk about the whole story. And it's a complex story, right? I'm a professor. I like nuance. I like complexity. I like it when we pay attention to the details. So I want to talk about the deists. I want to talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson kind of took all the miracles out of the Bible and thought it was a better Bible. I want to talk about James Madison and his very thorny situationship with religion. But I also want to ask a question I really hear. Which Christianity are you talking about? Which one? Because when we talk about the American founding, we can talk about the Catholics in Maryland, we can talk about Quakers, we can talk about Presbyterians, we can talk about Congregationalists, we can talk about this array of Christianities that went into the very beginnings of this country. So let's talk about the most famous and one of the first. You ready? Let's talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Let's talk about John Winthrop. Here they are. 1630. John Winthrop and the Puritans make their way here, and they found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They make their way to Plymouth and what we now know as Massachusetts. There's about 1,000 or so Puritans with John Winthrop, and as the story goes, they were fleeing England in order to build a society where they would be able to worship freely without the interference of the king and government-sanctioned Anglican Church. They were, in essence, fleeing Christian nationalism. If you read some of the sermons from that time at Oxford and other places, you will see all kinds of reasons that this was condemnable. Now, when they came, John Winthrop famously said, we're going to do what? We're going to set up, who did their homework? Let's see. We're going to set up a city on a hill, right? Our society, our civilization, our community will be a city on a hill. This is Matthew, right? Chapter 5, verse 14. Since then, this has been taken up by JFK, Ronald Reagan. Lots of folks love to talk about the city on a hill. As John Barry says, the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony believed it was the government's job to prevent error in religion. The city on a hill would be built by a government that ensured the right kind of Christianity was practiced throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was the idea. So the goal in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not to keep government out of religion, but to have the government enforce the right kind of religion, to make sure that the proper or holy type of Christianity was practiced. And if it wasn't, they would punish the perpetrators. In this scenario, the church hands over authority to the government because the state takes up the function of overseeing and disciplining and shaping the religiosity of the Christians under its authority. The church may preside over the liturgy and the sacraments, the baptisms, the preaching. There may be separate functions, but the executive is the state. This is damaging to Christianity, and it's damaging to the Christian church. Right now, we have places like Oklahoma and Louisiana where 10 Commandments bills have passed, where the 10 Commandments will be displayed in classrooms, are displayed in classrooms. So I want you to think about the 10 Commandments in the classroom. And a lot of folks are arguing we shouldn't do that, and there's some folks saying we should do that. My brain, Professor Brain, says, what translation are y'all using? Which 10 Commandments? Who's editing that? Because we now have a situation where the state government's going to decide which translation of your holy text your kids are going to see at your school. Do you want the government deciding if it's the KJV? Because I know our Catholic brothers and sisters don't. If you know that history, they don't love the King James Version. You can Google that later. Is it the NIV, the NRSV? Which one do you want the government deciding to display of your holy text on its walls? That's a minor example. But if we go back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we can see even more radical consequences of giving the government the authority over the church and its function. The part of the story we don't often hear in third grade history class or at Thanksgiving time is, yes, the Puritans did flee Christian nationalism so they could have religious freedom. And everyone in Massachusetts was able to worship freely as long as they did it the right way. Freedom was not free. It was just as restrictive as the king's Christian state back in England, only with a Congregationalist rather than an Anglican form of church and ethos. They fled Christian nationalism not to get away from it, but in order to set up the way they thought was the right kind of Christian state. This meant banishing Catholic priests. It meant seeing the indigenous peoples as enemies to be vanquished. It also meant that Christians who shared Puritan theology, but not Puritan politics, were to be punished. They were not welcome. If you disobeyed the Christian ethos of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was perhaps going to be grave consequences. And that brings us to Roger Williams. Is he up here? I love this picture of Roger Williams. Looks like someone got the last donut at church, right? He's trying not to be mad, but he's kind of mad. Roger Williams was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He came only a few months after that first 1,000 or so folks arrived. And he was recognized almost immediately as an incredibly talented preacher and churchman. He was offered a position in the church within the colony and thought to be kind of a future leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But he turned it down. He turned down a really good spot in what was, of course, a brand new venture of this colony in what they thought of as the New World. Why did he turn it down? He turned it down on the grounds that the church was insufficiently devoted to the worship of God. How could a city whose government represented the church, a government that enforced Christianity at every turn, not be Christian enough? How could the church be unfit for his service? One of the reasons that Williams gave is that he believed the authority of government lay with the people, not the church. In short, he believed that the church had succumbed to the authority of the state, and thus when people came to the church where he might be the minister, people would not be able to worship authentically. It would be a state-sanctioned, state-filtered Christianity. Williams didn't hold to the principle that the government should be the watchdog and regulator of religion. He thought that the only true church was the church that was free from the government and the government free from the church. If those two were separate, then Christians could form a church according to the gospel and a public square based on that witness. Now, in theological terms, Roger Williams is identical to his congregational Puritan brethren. Same God, same Bible, same approach to church. Trinitarian? Yes. Biblical literalist, inerrantist, whatever sort of anachronistic word we want to use? Yes. This was not a Catholic in Puritan New England. Catholic priests were banished, of course. Not a deist, as we've heard so much about the folks that would come 100, 130 years later in the form of founding fathers. Not someone who denied the Trinity, the sacrality of the Holy Text, or anything even close. He was not a monarchist. He was not loyal to the king in terms of church. None of that. Williams was viewed as dangerous nonetheless. He was told to censor himself, told to cancel himself and his ministry. It turns out cancel culture was alive and well in the 1600s, kids. It's not new. Now, he didn't comply sufficiently. He complained at his house and his dwelling to neighbors and friendly faces, and of course, the good Christian leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony found out. What did they do? Pray for him? No. They condemned him to a winter outside of the colony, told him never to come back. You all been to Massachusetts in the winter? It's pretty cold, kind of like Nebraska in the winter. No provisions, no support, nowhere to go. It was a death sentence in the form of political excision. Now, I'm going to come back to Roger Williams out there in the wilderness. But let's focus on the thesis I mentioned a few moments ago. Christian nationalism is harmful to your neighbors. We could tell this story from the perspective of the Catholic priests who were banished, of the indigenous peoples who met the Mather family, John Winthrop and so on. It's also harmful to the church and to all the Christians who are doing the legislating and the enforcing. Here's a couple things I think that the story of Roger Williams and the Massachusetts Bay Colony teaches us. When the government is an agent of power as it comes to religion, it is a set of institutions that yields and enforces what the public square looks like, whether that's through a king or a dictator or elected representatives. But regardless of that structure, the government is an agent of power. If the church becomes entangled with the government, if Christianity is adopted as an official part of the state, then the agent of power uses force in some form or another to create a Christian community. The way that the government goes about fixing the order that it sees when there's a problem is force. And Roger Williams saw this firsthand. Roger Williams was someone who saw the inner workings of English government. He was friends with Oliver Cromwell, the revolutionary, also friends with John Milton, the author. He was someone who saw the enormously bloody and ferocious death toll that rose in his native England. Not to mention what happened in the wars of religion on the European continent. Now, that's problematic. It's problematic when Christianity is cultivated by force. It's problematic because force never brings the kingdom of God. You might bring a man-made city on a hill. I'm not sure you can bring the kingdom of God by force. It's not reducible to a city built by government leaders. The kingdom is more than anyone could ever construct in the form of government, and at least from my reading, the kingdom of God is a matter of love. It's a matter of power through the cross rather than through an army or through might. It's a way of building a community that is different than earthly principalities. So Christian nationalism is harmful to your neighbors because when you use force, it is always harmful. But it's also harmful to the church. The attempt to infuse the government with Christianity and thus to give Christians an elevated place in society is so damaging to the very practice of the Christian faith. It's problematic because now, and this is really important, the government has the regulatory authority over Christianity. Now the state is the arbiter and judge of faith. And here's something I think is probably true. There's some of you who are still thinking, doesn't bother me. I'm safe. If we have a Christian nationalist government in the United States, they'll regulate Christianity how it should be. The country will look more like I think it probably ought to be. I'm going to see positive results from a government that legislates Christianity. It'll weed out immorality, ungodliness. But to me, friends, that's what the story of Roger Williams teaches us is never true. Christian nationalism in the form of a government that decides what is Christian and what is not means something, no matter who you are. White or black, orthodox, heterodox, inerrantist, fundamentalist, dare I say Methodist. There's going to be a time when you're the wrong kind of Christian. Roger Williams was supposed to be the star preacher, and his theology never changed. Roger Williams was a white guy who loved God, preached the Bible, and he was fresh off the boat from England. And they sent him off into the wilderness to die. If they'll do it to him, they'll do it to anyone. All right, we've been hanging out in the 1630s. Surely this can't be the case in contemporary United States, right? I mean, we just want to go back to a time when the country was a little more full of, Christian symbolism, Christian faith. Isn't that what the Christian nationalists who are popular and who have millions of followers and are really influential in various church circles around the country, isn't that what they want? Let's check it out. Let's see. Here is Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson is a pastor in Christchurch, pastor of Christchurch, I should say, in Moscow, Idaho. Doug Wilson is very, very influential. He is the head of a publishing house. He is the head of a seminary. He's the head of a network of churches. He speaks all over the country. And if you're like me and you consume way too much news and have made really bad decisions in your professional life, you know that he just appeared at NatCon 4. NatCon 4 is a political conference. And I was on stage with Al Mohler. Al Mohler is the leader of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The Southern Baptists are, of course, the largest Protestant denomination in the country, the largest Christian group in the country other than the Catholic Church. So Doug Wilson is not somebody in a basement somewhere with a blog. Doug Wilson is somebody who reaches millions of people every month. And he says this: in the republic I envision, Hindus would not be able to hold political office. In the Christian Nationalist Project, we don't want the smudge or hodgepodge. We want it to be explicitly Christian. We would want prayers at the political convention to be God the Father in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Unfortunately, those are some of the more benign statements Doug Wilson has made. He's famous for saying that the time of enslavement in this country was the time of the most peaceful race relations the United States had ever endured. One of his most cherished proteges is a man named Joel Webbin. Joel Webbin has a church down in Texas. He leads something called Right Response Ministries. He's on the stage often with Doug Wilson. Again, these are not folks with 8 followers on Instagram and an outdated Facebook page. These are folks who reach, in the case of Wilson, millions of people a month. In the case of Webbin, hundreds of thousands of folks each month. So, on our next slide, we have this quote from Joel Webbin. He was asked about revival. What would revival look like in the United States? It would look like millions of people being deported. It would look like mothers getting death row for murdering their children, referring to abortion. When talking about non-Christians and non-white people in America, he said this: throughout Scripture, the idea of full-blown invasions from foreign peoples who worship foreign gods, it is never in Scripture spoken of as a blessing of liberty. It is always spoken of as a judgment. I believe that America is under God's judgment, and I don't think that the forms or the expressions of God's judgment merely lie with Drag Queen Story Hour, but that they also include the fact that my neighborhood is 30% Hindu. If you watch the video in which he said this, he is so disturbed and angry that he took his child to the park and they met somebody who was not white and not Christian. That person was wearing Hindu garb, at least in his mind. I don't know exactly what the person was wearing, but what he says in the video is, it felt like I wasn't in the United States. I didn't know where I was. He also says that when he sees a white family at the playground, he feels more comfortable and safe because when it, quote unquote, goes down, he knows they'll be on his side. In terms of what we need as a government, and how we should sort of fix the United States, here's what Joel Webbin said on our next slide. We're degenerates. The Constitution, it's not suited for governing degenerates. But I think for a population that is degraded morally and culturally, religiously, as far as we have, you need power. Men must be governed. You need a Caesar. I don't think constitutioning even harder is going to get us out of our current mess. I have an even more cheery presentation I could have given you tonight. Of all the folks who have called for a Caesar to take control of a post-constitutional America, or folks who are at least what I would call Caesar curious, and wondering if that might not be our, it's a hot new trend, San Francisco. Folks who think Caesar just might be what we need to fix the country that's lost its way. Could be Patrick Deneen, the Notre Dame philosopher. Could be Kevin Slack, the Hillsdale College professor. Could be Michael Anton, the Claremont Institute think tank pundit. It could be Joel Webbin, the pastor. All are curious about maybe we need Caesar. Maybe democracy and that whole round table I described, it's just not working out. Because these brown folks, black folks, Asian folks, these Hindu folks and Muslim folks, they just keep showing up. Gay folks, they're on TV now. I'm just not sure anymore. I'm not sure that our Constitution can handle that. So maybe it's Caesar. What do you all think? All right, let's ask Stephen Wolfe. Here's Stephen Wolfe on our next slide. Stephen Wolfe is the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism. Now, The Case for Christian Nationalism ranked in the top 100 on Amazon when it came out in books. So I'm an author, I will admit, to checking the Amazon rankings from time to time. Every 20 to 30 minutes, no. And usually, I published an academic book, a very boring book in 2018 that no one should ever buy, ever. And, that comes out, it's your first book, you're very excited about it, and it's like, you're ranked 4 million and, something, right? All right, cool, whatever. There's 20 million books on Amazon. This book is in the top 100 for a couple weeks, y'all. So how many seminarians, how many pastors, how many 21-year-old theology students, how many of those folks read that book and are reading that book? So here's some highlights from that book. In Stephen Wolfe's mind, nations can only be founded on a shared ethnicity because your kin have belonged to this people on this land, to this nation in this place, and so they bind you to that people and place, creating a common Volkgeist. So we're now talking about Volk and homeland. Wolfe's argument for nationalism based on the shared ethnicity of a Volk based in blood relations comes into focus when he explains his intended reader. So who did he write the book for? He doesn't leave it up to chance. I am male and am rooted ancestrally in Western Europe and am speaking largely to a Western European male audience. He says male here for a number of reasons, but just by coincidence, him and Joel Webbin have both said the 19th Amendment should be repealed so that women can no longer vote. And that godly women would gladly give up their vote so that society could be ordered rightly in God's eyes and according to God's design. It gets better. Next slide. What does Wolfe's view of the Christian nation look like on the ground? On Twitter, he's argued that interracial marriage is almost always a sin. I got a white mom with blonde hair. I got a Japanese-American dad from Hawaii. That would make me a sin. Women should willingly give up the vote in order to ensure the nation is run by men as God intended. In a nation run by a hierarchy of Christian leaders with a Christian prince at the helm, Wolfe also advocates for the enforcement of Sabbath laws and the punishment of false religion, i.e. anything outside of the state-approved Christian practice. Pastor and theologian Stephen Wolfe, a man whose book has sold way more copies than your favorite authors, a guy who just finished a postdoc at Princeton. All right, let's talk about Charlie Kirk. Who knows about Charlie Kirk? Most of you don't. Bless you, you're living good lives. Beatific, I can't even say it. Your vision is beatific compared to mine. Charlie Kirk runs TPUSA. We heard of TPUSA, maybe? Okay. TPUSA started as a young person's conservative network. So we're talking thousands of chapters of TPUSA, which is not a toilet paper convention. Turning Point USA has chapters on almost every college campus across the country. So you can go join a TPUSA chapter at almost any university we have. And it's supposed to be a conservative network. Now, it has expanded into a network that has conferences for pastors, conferences for women, and many others. Charlie Kirk, if you are feeling like you want to not have a good night, you can Google him tonight. And Charlie Kirk is one of the most influential conservative Christians in this country. He's been discipled by folks out of the New Apostolic Reformation. And in my mind, if you said, please write down the most influential, like conservative spokespeople that we have in the United States in 2024, he would make my top 10 list, hands down, okay? So Charlie Kirk has said a lot of things that I think are really problematic and worse. But a couple of years ago, if you would have asked Charlie Kirk or any or most conservative politician or pundit on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, what do you think about Martin Luther King Jr.? You usually would have gotten something from Ted Cruz or Charlie Kirk that said, here's a quote from MLK, that's why we should build a wall, right? The strategy was take quote from Martin Luther King Jr., plop it here, and then explain why it really propels your very conservative right-wing agenda. Now, something that, at least in my view, happy to talk about this over a Diet Coke after the event, did not line up 100% of the time with Charlie Kirk and Ted Cruz or whoever was talking, right? But you could see the play. Martin Luther King Jr. is an American saint. There is a holiday. I used to live in D.C. There is a monument. Martin Luther King Jr. is unassailable in this country, right? Now, in my view, he's been largely whitewashed, and there's a whole problematic way that Martin Luther King Jr. is rendered in the public square that we have now. Nonetheless, you would think that it would be impossible to say something bad about Martin Luther King Jr. Nonetheless, here we have it. I have a very, very radical view on this, but I can defend it, and I've thought about it. We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. MLK was awful. He's not a good person. He said one good thing he actually didn't believe. Not in a basement with a blog. One of the most influential folks we have in the country. Where did Charlie Kirk last speak? Where was his last major speaking engagement? The Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, like 5 weeks ago. By the way, Joel Webbin, who we just saw a couple slides ago, thinks Martin Luther King Jr. is in hell. Stonewall Jackson in heaven. So we can talk about that later too if you'd like. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost done. This is the last one, I promise. I can email you the longer presentation if you'd like. Here's Kevin Roberts. If you change a culture on a profound level, you can break the most basic functioning elements of civilization. In the case of contraceptives, we are a society remade according to a research agenda set by the party of destruction. Kevin Roberts is the leader of the Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts refers to himself as a cowboy Catholic. He's called for a national abortion ban. He has said that teachers are insane and that we are coming for them. And he says here in his yet-to-be-published book that contraception of any kind is a cause for the destruction of our civilization. He has said openly in public that he would like to ban all forms of contraception in the country. Kevin Roberts is Opus Dei affiliated, and he also is the leader of the Heritage Foundation, which some of you will remember is the publisher of Project 2025. So if you've heard about Project 2025, you heard about a 922-page manual that is built by the Heritage Foundation with sign-off from TPUSA and Hillsdale College and Liberty University and Moms for Liberty and so many others. They wrote that for the next conservative president, that's their words, for the whoever that may be, to use as a plug-and-play manual for their government. So Kevin Roberts thinks that women should be expected to have children, that it's not a choice but a transcendent expectation. He thinks that if you do not have children, you are hurting our society. All right, let's get to the hope, shall we? I can tell y'all are. It's Thursday night. It's supposed to be a fun time. Let's go back to Roger Williams. Roger Williams survived that winter. I think some of you know that. He, of course, went on to found Providence in the Narragansett Bay and what became known as Rhode Island or Rogue Island. In the charter for the new city that he set up, there was no mention of God. no decree that its citizens must be Christian in any form, no mandate for a Christian nation or values or morality. Here's John Barry, author of Roger Williams and the Birth of an American Soul. Williams' most implacable enemies never questioned his piety. His devotion to God informed everything he did, his thinking, his writing, his actions. In 2 volumes of his surviving letters, hardly a single paragraph fails to refer to God in an intimate way. For him to omit any mention of God in this political compact underscored his conviction that to assume God embraced any state other than ancient Israel profaned him and signified human arrogance in the extreme. And Providence's other settlers unanimously agreed. Here's what the compact said. We, whose names are here under, do promise to subject ourselves in active and passive obedience to all such orders or agreements as shall be made for public good, only in civil things. The government was to be utterly mundane in the most literal sense, and that it dealt solely with the world. Unlike all other English settlements, this one neither set up a church nor required church attendance. Indeed, later it would decree that a simple solemn profession had as full force as an oath in court. And all of this was, of course, revolutionary for the time. Williams wanted to set up a government that enabled Christians to build the kingdom of God. How? Through their godly witness in the world, leaving the imposition of power to the Almighty when it came to sin, and embracing the sharing of power when it came to all of those around him. By sharing power in government, Williams maintained it would be possible to demonstrate God's eternal power through the church and throughout the world. Now, Roger Williams had a profound impact on the American founding. Roger Williams was a friend, as I said, of John Milton. But Roger Williams' work also had an influence on John Locke. If you take civics class, you know John Locke had a profound influence on the founding fathers who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The idea of the separation of church and state, that there should be a wall between the church and state, was written by Roger Williams more than a century before Thomas Jefferson ever thought it or penned it. His work was found on the shelves of Jefferson. He influenced those who helped launch James Madison's career. When we talk about the American founding and this is a Christian nation, I want to know which one, because there's more than one to pick from. It's not a straight line. It's a question of what kind of city on a hill or what kind of kingdom you want to build. So here's my original thesis. Christian nationalism harms the church because it prioritized creating the city of God in place of the kingdom of God. Sorry, Augustine. It collapses the spiritual and the earthly, denigrating the spiritual. It makes a vision for a return to the Garden of Eden into the wilderness, Genesis 1 or Revelation 20 and 21 into Exodus 20. Do you want an earthly city that forces people to obey Christian men, or a kingdom of God based on the eternal revolution of Jesus Christ? My guess, and this comes from history, is that you will not turn the tides through fear and oppression. I think we all know that Jesus was crucified by the state, after all. And when he was, he trusted in the power of the Creator without appeal to earthly force. Put your sword away, Peter. Now, I'll just close by saying that some of you probably know another famous sermon from New England called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. And I'll admit that Jonathan Edwards and I are not too close aligned theologically, okay? We just don't agree on a lot. And I don't really like the idea of praying to an angry God. I'm just going to come out and say it. That's for sure. That's like, But I do know something else, and that tonight, when I think about a Christian who thinks about the divine as an angry father, if that's you, could be. You might be a humanist who came to listen tonight. You might be an agnostic, an atheist. You might be Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist. You might be Quaker or Mennonite, others who were persecuted fiercely in colonial New England. It doesn't matter who you are tonight. Here's what I think, is that it may be one thing. It may be one thing to be a sinner in the hands of an angry God. Like I might get there. I don't know what it would take in my life. I don't know what kind of change and what books I'd have to read and podcasts I'd have to listen to and praying I'd have to do. But I might get to a place where I think that I'm a sinner in the hands of an angry God. You might just get there with me. I don't think you're ever going to convince me to be a sinner in the hands of angry men. I'm not going to be considered somebody who's sinful in the hands of men who call themselves the powers and representatives of my government with the authority to enforce what it means to be a sinner, a saint, a child of God, or anything else. That's not going to happen. So rather than a sinner in the hands of angry men, I will say that for me to be an American is to be one who says, I will hold my hands out, not in prayer to that angry God of Jonathan Edwards or in submission to those angry men who want to excise me from the Commonwealth like they did to Roger Williams. But I'll hold my hands out as my own. I'll use my feet to walk to the voting booth. I will exist in a place where my body shares power with all the bodies around me. I'll hold the hands of any person as my neighbor, regardless of their faith, regardless of their origin, regardless of their identity, who adheres to the idea that we are going to share power, that we're human beings with a conscience, free to exercise, and that we have liberty as a given right in this world. I'll hold hands with all of those people because that is the only way for all of us to be free. And it's the only way, in my mind, for the Christian to build the kingdom of God. History tells us that when we put ourselves in the hands of angry men as sinners, death and brutality follow. Exclusion and excision follow. Wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, between Anglicans and other Protestants, between everyone, everywhere, all at once seems to happen. When I teach the wars of religion in my classes, do you know what my students say? You got to be lying. There's no way this got to be this bad. This could not have been this bloody. You mean they were killing each other because one was Protestant and one was Catholic? And let's just be honest. When we get to a place where the representatives of government think of themselves as the representatives of God and the church through the state, we get a lot of other things. The justification of using and enslaving and quote-unquote owning other human beings. We get a doctrine of discovery, which tells us that any white European who discovers a land not occupied by other white Europeans is theirs, regardless of anyone who might be there already. So instead of being a sinner in the hands of angry men, I would say that whether you're a Christian or not, let's be citizens who find their voice in the will of the people. Let's give consent to the majority. Let's recognize authority as we agree to it. And let's challenge anyone who would overthrow that power-sharing agreement in their call for a red Caesar, a Christian prince, or anything else. When I think about the 2024 election and any election in our lifetime, this is what I think about. Could be for president, could be for county supervisor, could be for mayor, it could be for the PTA. I think of stakes that are incredibly high for everybody. For Latin folks, for Asian folks, for black folks, for white folks, for non-binary folks, for trans folks, for men, for women, those who have recent immigration stories and those who don't. Christian nationalism is not the way to a Christian nation. It's the way to brutality, oppression, and death in the name of Christianity, in order to build a nation for angry and powerful men. That's why I stand against it. That's why I see it as a threat to democracy. Our elections are what maintain our freedom to govern ourselves, and they're also what allows the Christian church to build the kingdom of God. To quote Roger Williams, when they have opened a gap in the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever made his garden a wilderness. And thus, that cannot be a true religion which needs carnal weapons to uphold it. Thanks.
You have an interesting background that brings
Sure.
you to this point in your life where you're feeling the need to have this conversation with everyone. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got here? What was your journey
Sure.
to this point?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in a non-religious home, and I grew up in Southern California in Anaheim, right by Disneyland. I know folks think that California is this sort of progressive wasteland where we learn Karl Marx in kindergarten and stuff. But where I grew up is really the Bible Belt of Southern California. It's a place that was, in the 50s and 60s, largely farmland until a widespread migration of millions of people happened after the war during the Cold War years. And that's when Midwesterners and Southerners made their way to Southern California by the millions. By the 70s, Southern California, or California in general, had more Southerners than any Southern state. My mom and her family picked up from the Boot Heel in Missouri in 1958 and drove in the station wagon to Southern California. So when I converted in a really extreme way. It was an evangelical megachurch and a place where I was a minister by 18. I was a full-time minister and married by 20 and off to seminary. And so I didn't convert and sort of dabble. I was somebody who had given his entire life and identity to my evangelical faith. I often would stand outside the movie theater in my town with a friend and ask kids my age on Friday nights, if they knew they were going to spend eternity. Not a great way to make friends, it turns out. I led a Bible study at the lunchtime at my public school. I gave my first sermon when I was a sophomore in high school. So that led to just deep questioning and wanting to pursue what I felt was truth in every way possible. So I ended up going to graduate school for way too long and got degrees in theology and philosophy and religious studies. And now I feel like 20 years later, I stand at this really weird intersection because I feel so at home in places like St. Andrews. And I feel such a responsibility to talk to anyone within Christian communities like yours about the things that I think are really threatening to our democracy. But I also get invited to speak at secular and humanist and atheist gatherings. So in the last 2 years, I spoke at the American Atheist Convention, and I'll be at the Freedom from Religion Foundation in about 3 weeks. And I guess for me, it's important that somebody kind of stand in between all of those different groups and hopefully not only get them to work together at times, but for them to understand that they largely have some of the same threats looming over them, and there's a possibility for coalitions to be built. It's easy to think of the American Atheists as a convention where they're just finally fine-tuning that proof against the existence of God, and once they get it, they're going to unleash it. But when you go to those gatherings, the things that the American Atheists talk about are voting rights, reproductive rights, systemic racism, social justice. So what they care about is largely what a lot of the folks I think in this room care about. And so I think there's ways to build a lot of bridges and coalitions and stuff. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah.
That's great. I think it's important, as I've gotten to know you, to understand what your journey's been. You're not a random guy who decided to do this. Your path has led you here.
Yeah, come a long way from the movie theater, I think, but no, yeah.
So one of the things that often gets talked about, because it's not just in the topic tonight, as we kind of branded it, isn't just Christian nationalism, but specifically white Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Some of the feedback that I'm sure you get and is made in the media from folks in this camp are that there are plenty of people of color who are, let's call them evangelicals, or folks that are as inspired to move in this direction. What's the distinction?
Yeah, great question. So there is sociological data on this, so this is not just my opinion. I'm happy to email you the slides from other presentations I've given that have all these statistics on them. So what we find is exactly what James just talked about. There are many white Christian nationalists in the country. There's also Christian nationalists who are black and people of color. In ways that are very similar to Roger Williams and his colleagues in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, oftentimes, theologically, those groups line up really well. If you ask folks who score as Christian nationalists, who are white and black, about their understanding of the Bible, their understanding of the church, they often, on paper, look theologically like, if not identical, really similar. okay? But then two things happen. You start asking them about the story of the country. And the white Christian nationalists, the data tells us, almost always tell a story of nostalgia. This country used to be great. It's no longer. If you asked white evangelicals in particular in 2016, 2017, 70% of them would have said, this country was great in the 1950s, okay? So this country was great at a time before the end of Jim Crow, before the Civil Rights Movement, right? Before the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, immigration reform, before the Equal Rights Amendment was brought to the brink of passing, before Stonewall, before the Levin case that made interracial marriage protected all over the country. I mean, I could go on, right? So we want to go back to the 1950s, and understandably, when you think about that black Christian or other Christians of color, the 1950s didn't seem as great, right? When you're living under Jim Crow, when you're living under redlining, when you're living under a system that doesn't see you as equal around the table as everyone else, you don't always want to go back to that. So the Christians, the black Christians, for example, who score as Christian nationalists, often tell a much different story about the country. They tell a story of hope, right? We're not a Christian nation. We never have really been one, but we could be, right? We could be, and that's what we're working toward. So are there Christian nationalists who are not white? Yes. But the Christian nationalists who are not white are usually facing forward and to the future saying, we might be a more perfect union if we keep trying, right? Like Raphael Warnock is always talking about a covenant, right? And that covenant is largely inclusive of all Americans. When white Christian nationalists talk about the Christian nation they want, it's going back to supposedly when we were the city on a hill, right? That we used to be before all those interlopers got in and those women started wanting rights and before, all that Asian immigration after 1965. Let's just get a wall around that city on a hill because, God needs something, right? I mean, it's just not, his city isn't going great, right? So that's often the ways that they differ when it comes to politics. So those are the stories they tell, and then politically, you can see it so forcefully. You can see it in the ways that black Christians vote and black Christian nationalists vote. Their black Christian nationalism does not lead to watching Fox News. Like, there's data on that. It does not lead to voting for Republicans. It does not lead to voting in certain ways for certain issues. Whereas Christian nationalism, when it comes to white Christian nationalists, is a strong predictor, and I can send you all the sociological data on this, for whether or not you believe systemic racism is a real thing, whether or not you think that police brutality is a real thing, whether or not you think that there are too many immigrants in the country for the country to function, and so on and so forth. It is also a grand and very reliable predictor for support for Trump. White Christian nationalists on the whole, if you score as a white Christian nationalist on the survey, we know that 8 out of 10 times you're going to vote for Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020. So those are the differences, and that's just kind of how the sociologists have provided that data to help us sort that out.
Thank you. So thank you for these questions. There are some incredible questions in here, and some of these I'm fearful would take hours to answer in depth. They're really great. But a big portion of them are, okay, we hear you, we know someone that you're describing.
Yep.
What do we do?
Yeah.
How do we talk to them? How do we engage with them? What does engagement look like?
Yeah. So I think, I have come to a place where I think about engagement on two levels. I think on a civic level, it's really important to realize we're in a situation where the Joel Webbins and the Stephen Wolfs and the Doug Wilsons and the Charlie Kirks, they are in a place where they're saying that Martin Luther King Jr. is a bad guy, we need a Caesar, women shouldn't vote, and so on. It's not stopping Doug Wilson from getting invited to NatCon to shake hands with Al Mohler, a conference where sitting senators like Josh Hawley and representatives like Marjorie Taylor Greene also spoke. So NatCon is also not like in a basement somewhere, right, in Appalachia, okay? NatCon is a place where Josh Hawley gave his own manifesto about Christian nationalism. So it's not stopping that from happening. Why do I bring that up again? Because they are willing to attack every piece of soft tissue in the American body politic in order to get power. Okay? Everyone. And that could mean not certifying election results in state houses. That could be claiming that any and all elections were rigged if you didn't win. I speak around the country, and I was speaking in my home state of California in a farming community in Central California last year, and folks talked about people taking over their school board, right? And books being banned and this kind of stuff. And I said, well, how'd that happen? They said, well, these candidates ran and they won, and these candidates don't have children in the school system. They're not educators. They just ran because they wanted to be on the board. And I said, well, who ran against them? And they said, nobody, right? So any piece of soft tissue in the American body politic is seen as a place of weakness. So civically, the response for me is action and engagement. What are you doing, and how can you do it, right? That's my question. Now, that's one. That's civics. On a personal level, if you are thinking about your nephew, your cousin, your parent, your friend, your colleague, it's a really hard thing, and I think you all know that. You might have known or gleaned from my presentation, I really like data. I like to argue. My wife will tell you. And she has come into the room at 3 a.m. to say, hey, you've been on that Facebook thread since like 9. There's 463 comments now. I don't think Jack from high school is any closer to changing his mind. Do you want to come to bed? And I think we've all been there, whether it's Thanksgiving table and gravy flying all over or storming out of the birthday party, whatever. If you want to talk to your relative or your loved one, you have to talk about feelings. And I know that sounds really weird, but data and evidence aren't going to be the things you can use to engage because they don't think your data or your evidence matters and they don't believe it. So, if you want to sit down with them over tea or over a beer or while you're grilling in the backyard, the question I would ask would not be, how can you be so stupid to believe this about that? The question
I'm shocked that's not the way that's going to work.
A lot of graduate school I went to. I think you have to start with, hey, when I hear you talk about stuff like politics or your schools or whatever, you're so angry. Like, tell me about that. What are you angry about? I want to hear it. Like, I want to hear the kind of ways that, you're just really upset about how things are going. Talk to me. You seem like really anxious about the future. You got these little kids, and you're not sure what's going to happen with them. Like, talk to me about that. I got little kids too, or I got whatever. I've been there. I'm a parent. My kids are grown now, but I understand, whatever. And if you get there with them about anxiety and anger and resentment and fear and even hope, then they might let you do that. They might let you do that, right? They might let you tell them about what you're angry about and what you're anxious about and what you're hopeful for. And all of a sudden, there's a chance, and it's not a tried and true equation. I'm not selling you a program for $49.99, but there's a chance that they will see you as a human being who is not what they heard about you, a woke, globalist Marxist who hates America and hates God and has lost their mind. What they might see is that person they used to know, their colleague, their nephew, their friend, who is a human. And if that happens, you might open a space where they say, I know them, and we had a good talk, and that felt good, and maybe we can do it again. And over time, there's a chance that there will be a point of opening, a point of vulnerability, a point of trust, where it is possible to kind of talk about some things that really matter in a way that are a little more direct and a little more engaging. Now, you can't do this if you're not safe. So if they have certain feelings about your identity, your sexual identity, your gender identity, your racial identity, who you married, I'm not saying to put yourself in that situation. But if you do feel safe and you want to put this kind of energy into that relationship, I don't think the shortcut of proving them wrong is going to work, unfortunately. And I do think that, surprisingly, the answer is to go to emotion, affect, and feeling as a beginning, perhaps not an end, in a way to build that relationship.
So maybe building off of that a little bit, some of the questions are coming around to one of the founding principles of the United States was pluralism, which is a very difficult concept, right? We're unique, let's call it, in the world, and this is an ideology and an aspiration. Is what we're seeing now a defeat of pluralism as the founders put it out there, and is, we think back to medieval Europe, kings, King Henry VIII and Anglicanism, or any of the other, religious / governmental, this is not a new concept.
Yeah.
Are we a failed experiment?
No, I don't think we're a failed experiment. I think what we're seeing is not the end of pluralism, but a reaction to the day-to-day realities of pluralism. So Robert P. Jones wrote a book in 2016 called The End of White Christian America. And it's a very provocative title. But if you read the book, what he meant was about 2015, a year before a certain election, the country reached this tipping point that it had never experienced before, and that was that it was no longer a majority white Christian nation, right? Now, we're still a majority white nation by we're kind of getting to that point too, but we're not a majority white Christian nation. And I actually just interviewed Robert last week, and if you look at those numbers now, 8-9 years later, right, it's gone from 44% of the country's white Christian to it just goes down every year, okay? So my response would be, on a day-to-day level, this country continues to be more diverse, right? It continues to be less religious every year. That's just what the numbers say, right? The fastest growing religious group in this country are the religiously unaffiliated, right? A place like Texas will be, or is already just barely majority minority right now, right? We see an increasing number, if we look at Gen Z, of Americans identifying as LGBTQ in some way, right? So what I see in the resurgence of white Christian nationalism in the ways I've talked about it tonight, and in what we see in our politics in certain ways, is a reaction to this, okay? We only have 13% of the country today that is white evangelical. White evangelicals have never been this small of the American citizenry. It is a brand new position to be in. So my response when I see Joel Webbin saying, I don't want to see Hindu people at the park, right? Or I see manifestos from Josh Hawley about how this is a Christian nation is, these are the last gasps of the white Christian standing at the round table saying, I demand more power than everyone else and I'm going to get it. And we're at a point where they're willing to reach across that table and say, and if you don't get it, I'm going to come over there and I'm going to make you get it, right? So y'all remember, we went to the 1600s, right? Let's go to the 2000s. Remember that whole George W. Bush presidency, right? So George W. Bush was a white evangelical, right? Y'all remember that? He was saved. He had a born-again experience, the whole thing. But when George W. Bush got done being president, I think a lot of the folks I'm talking about, even in 2008, it just didn't scratch the itch, right? Because 2008 was this moment where once again, country's getting less religious, it's getting more diverse, gay people are on TV now, right? This is what you hear at the dinner table. I know you do. And then what? Who'd they elect? Barack Hussein Obama. So here comes a guy with mixed race background, a black man, black wife, black kids, a father from a different country, an immigrant story. He grew up in Hawaii. My family's from Hawaii. Is that even part of the United States? You got to change your money. Sometimes I tell people, oh, you're going to Hawaii, you got to better change your money. Yeah. What do they use there? Yeah. So they elected this guy named Hussein, who has that American story. Bets are off. Now gay people can get married. Bets are off now. So when we get to 2016, I'm not looking at the round table anymore saying, hey, I want to, give me George W. Bush, that born-again guy. That's a cool story down there in Texas. Give me Mike Huckabee. You all remember Mike Huckabee? Right? Dad joke telling, corny, Arkansas governor. I don't want that guy. Ted Cruz doesn't have the juice. I want the bully. Give me the barbarian. Give me the one who will reach across the table and say, we might be the minority. There might be less of us every year, but I'm going to come over there and you're going to know your place whether you like it or not. If I have to deport 20 million of you, I will. If I have to ban folks who are Muslim from the country, I will. I could go on, but I don't think it's the end of pluralism. I think it's a raging reaction to the ever-increasing diversity of this country. And there is so many folks fighting for that vision of this country, but there are also so many who are doing everything they can to prevent it from being our reality going forward.
So a few of the questions are brought up, right? We have, we have this thing called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We have the First Amendment. We have the Supreme Court. We have protection. How protected are we?
Well, I mean, we do have all those things. So I'll just give you data points so that you can't, some of you are going to leave mad, I know, but you can't leave mad because I just gave my opinion. So I'm going to give you my data, and then you can be mad about my data, okay? Two things have happened, I think, that are worth note. So we have a person running for vice president who said in 2021 that the person he's running for president with, the first thing they should do on the first day of being president is fire every government employee we have and put in loyalists, okay? And then when it's taken to the Supreme Court and the court decides and Justice Roberts writes his opinion that the president should say to Justice Roberts, thanks for your opinion, come make me, where's your army, okay? So that person's running for vice president now. So he's told us how protected we are. The Supreme Court recently decided that if a president is acting in their formal duties as president, that they are immune from criminal prosecution. Now, there's a lot of gray area, right? And nobody really knows what that means. What is your formal and informal role as president? How we decide that? Can that be separated in a court of law? That's all being discussed every day, all day right now in certain corners of cable news and so on. But it does mean that a president could act in their formal role, kill their political enemies, unleash the military on American citizens, and anything else they wanted, and not be punished for it unless they were impeached with the very high bar of impeachment in the Senate, which is almost near impossible in the very split Senate. So, like, the current president's plan for student debt cancellation came out like last week. Did anybody see this? Guess what was decided? Can't do it. Not constitutional. So Americans, your president, could kill their political enemy right now as president, and that's good and fine. They cannot forgive your student loans, though. That's how protected we are.
So maybe going off a little bit, we're going to move away from politics a little bit and into the church. What role does the church play in this? Where are we? Right? A couple of comments came in of, I don't hear pastors talking about this. The only people we hear talking about this are the mega churches that are on TV and are getting the airtime. What else is going on?
Yeah.
Where does the church go?
There's a lot of, so I'll just say again, there's a lot of folks who I think, clearly here at St. Andrews, doing great stuff. But I think of so many others, and it is hard. It is hard to get airtime away from the mega church pastors and so on. It's really hard for churches who are not following this path to be the ones on the front page, to get anyone outside of their communities to kind of pay attention. So, but there's so much of work going on. The Baptist Joint Committee is all over the country with their initiative, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, right? And they're working with denominations of every stripe. They're also working with humanist and secular groups. And their goal is to say, we want to build a United States, a public square, where we're all free to exercise our identities. And that is the kind of public square that will allow us in the church to create the kingdom of God as we see it. And so that work is happening. It's wonderful, and folks are doing great. I was just with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State organization at their conference, and they have a faith advisory board of Christian clergy, Jewish rabbis, and folks from all kinds of interfaith work who are doing the same thing. So you're not alone, and if you are willing to look and to kind of join up, there are folks who identify as Christians. There are churches all over the Midwest, the West Coast, the East Coast, the South, that see this as a threat, and they're working against it. The Interfaith Alliance is doing great work on this. So are there people doing it? Yes. Unfortunately, about 50 years ago, the brand name of Christianity in this country became a different kind than I think often is perhaps cultivated in spaces like this one. And so it is hard to find a way into the headlines and onto the airwaves and so on and so forth. But it's not impossible, and you're not alone. And there are networks of people doing just incredible work all around this stuff.
So the next question really dovetails into what you just said, right? It feels like, to many of us, Christianity has been co-opted. Mm-hmm. And there's a brand. We have a brand problem.
Yep.
That it has been labeled in a certain way, and that's the way everyone views it, as this homogeneous group. You referred to, the 1600s. The country was founded in a lot of different Christian traditions. Mm-hmm. How do we take it back?
Yeah. Well, so I like coming at this two ways. As a scholar, when people say those folks aren't real Christians, I say, I think they are Christians, because they're doing what they're doing in the name of God and in Christ. And so if I'm studying these folks, and I have to take them at their word, right? I'm not going to name names, but you can think of whoever you want to think of and say they're not a real Christian, right? Because of their judgment, because of their idolatry, because of their whatever. And my response as a scholar is, well, I think they are, and I need to take them seriously. Like when I see the Christian flag at January 6th, right? I got to take that seriously, okay? But I also think there's a tremendous witness coming, not from the scholarly side, but from the church side, that says, in fact, you are Christians who've betrayed, right, the gospel. You have given into the idolatry of power and enforcement in the name of God, and that means you've forsaken the witness of Christ and his gospel. So there is a way to take it back, and there are many people so perceptive to it. Unfortunately, right, straight lines, strict boundaries are much easier to identify than a coalition of people, right, who have different identities, who have different approaches to faith, and especially a congregation like St. Andrew's, where you're willing to have hard conversations, where you're willing to disagree and still sit next to each other on Sunday mornings. It's a lot harder to cover that for the journalist that doesn't know a lot about religion, or the folks who are trying to put Christianity on the front page. And so how do you take it back? Well, I think it comes through one of the values that I saw on the wall here at the church, which is acting and standing up for social justice, right? The more that the witness in your communities is of Christians who are inclusive, who are loving, who are non-judgmental, who are not trying to impose, but are trying to welcome, the more that folks see that that is the reality of this church, the more it becomes their lived reality. And so it's a ground-up approach. It's a ground-up movement. And again, you're not alone. There's so many folks doing that. I will say, I don't know if this will encourage you or not, but 13% of this country are evangelical, white evangelicals. 13% of this country are mainline Christians, right? And so one group, a very, what I would say, conservative, stringent group of white Christians in this country is shrinking every year. And congregations different than them are not necessarily shrinking. So there is hope, but it's an uphill battle. I ask my students all the time, some of them have very little interaction with Christianity. Hey, who are the Christians you know from pop culture, right? And they always name who? Like the white evangelicals they see on TV. So it is an uphill battle, but it's not impossible.
So maybe one last question, or really just an opportunity, right? You've told me that you're not always doom and gloom, that you're actually fun at parties, and we should invite you back and have a party. What's the message of hope that you're going to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, the message of hope is there's a lot more people who are not Christian nationalists than are in this country, period. Absolutely, period. And when folks who want to enter into a pluralist, multiracial democracy build coalitions together, they win. Period. So we've seen this in the post-Dobbs world, where Roe v. Wade was overturned, in ways that surprised everyone. Places like Kansas, right? Places all over the Midwest, some places in the South, have voted to put reproductive rights on the ballot and to bring it to a direct vote to the people, right? Wisconsin, not too far from here, had an off-cycle Supreme Court election, right? Judge Janet, you all know about Judge Janet, okay? And if this election went one way, for the first time in a long, long time, Wisconsin would have a liberal majority on its Supreme Court. And folks prognosticated Wisconsin would vote to ungerrymander, right, their districts. And there might be something like a fair playing field, and the will of the people might be actually represented in Wisconsin. So if you go back and look at the news cycle from that election, an off-cycle spring election, right? So we usually have elections in November. People usually vote when there's a presidential thing going on. This is an off-cycle election. You got college students in Green Bay waiting 2 and 3 hours to vote that day, right? Because they want Judge Janet on the Wisconsin Supreme Court because they believe in reproductive rights and they also want their state to be ungerrymandered, right? That's hopeful. That's super, super hopeful. And in my book, I point to all the examples of ways that when people work together in these coalitions, they win. Boston has its first woman mayor. That woman mayor happens to be Boston's first Asian American mayor, right? Okay? We have folks, we have stories like that up and down, right? From Wilmington, North Carolina, having its first black woman mayor, all the way to having somebody who's now running for president who would be the first black woman and first Asian president that we might have. So when people work together, and by people I mean those who want a multiracial pluralist democracy, they win. But I'm telling you, the doom and gloom comes because oftentimes folks are not willing to pay attention, they don't care, and they don't realize all of the soft tissue in the American body politic that's being attacked. Those school boards that were taken over because nobody ran, right? You didn't realize it was election day because it's like just for the local elections, okay? Nobody got out and knocked doors for the mayoral candidates, okay? That happens in almost every small town across the country. And there's one side of the equation, unfortunately, that thinks they're in a cosmic battle for good and that they are the godly warriors restoring to the country to its rightful place. That they are the ones who are going to rebuild the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they're not motivated by one issue. They're not motivated by one election, right? There's some folks who vote and think, well, we did it. My person won. Glad that's over. Let's go play pickleball and have brunch, right? The other side doesn't do that. When they lose, they already have plan B, plan C, plan D ready to go. They recuperate, they raise money, they organize, and they get moving. And they're doing it right now. Can send you that presentation too if you want it. So not only is it a matter of working together to win, but it's working together in every part, every tendon, every ligament, every muscle of the American body politic. And that's where everyone can be involved. This is not about who's going to be in the White House. It's part of it. It's a big part of it. But who's the county supervisor? What's going on with the library? What's going on with the school board? What's happening with the elections and who's volunteering to make sure that all goes well? All of those places. Who's the Solicitor General of your state? All of those places have a grand effect on whether or not this experiment continues or whether or not it's co-opted by folks who would like to take it back to a very retrograde vision of what this country could be.
Thank you, Brad. But we're going to invite Chris back up to close us out. But Brad, thank you for taking these questions.
Yep.
This was
Thank
great.
you.